All right, me. It is early December. I think it's like December 5th. And I just read Jay Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is the third time I've read this book. I read it in high school for 10th grade English. I read it for my modernist American literature class. It was the first book that we read for that class, and I'm reading it now. So a couple different times I've read it. Lots of different kind of thoughts on it, but the book itself, I don't think there's a lot that I can say that hasn't been said before. So instead, I'm going to mostly focus on the way that I think this book has affected, or it is reminiscent of just general American culture, and then head back to the book itself. This book, I think, is probably the most famous example of a book that is written and then becomes popular way after. And the reason for it, right, is this book is published in 1925. It's Fitzgerald's, I think, third major novel. Might have been his second one. But right, we're coming to the point of where people are stopping enjoying reading about the excesses of the 1920s, right? Because we're kind of sitting in between this weird spot of, it's no longer this new novel thing at the time that this is being published, but also we're not quite yet to the point of the Great Depression, in which the falling short of the American dream that a lot of this book talks about and references comes to light and will be appreciated. We're kind of in this weird middle spot, and so it doesn't get recognition a lot when it's first published. In fact, if I remember correctly, when it first gets out there to a lot of heavy critics, they enjoy it to an extent, but then for the kind of everyday reader, it kind of gets treated more as like a mystery, right? And that's just not what it is, right? And so it kind of falls to the wayside. It gets effectively just ignored, right? And then it's not until the 1940s, in which during World War II, this book was sent out as part of the program in which they gave literature so that soldiers had something to read while in war, right? And this is one of the books that's chosen for it. And I think it's hard to decide as to why this book specifically gets chosen, but hello, cat. Really, what I would argue, and what I think, what makes this book really interesting, is that it threads this very fine line in which it talks about and it discusses some incredibly major and important realizations that you have to have about the way that kind of, the whole American dream works, and, all of those things, and the way that American society works, while also being relatively simple and easy to understand. Right? And so I would argue that because of that, and because it kind of threads this fine line in which it doesn't necessarily work for critics, but also doesn't necessarily work for the general audience, right? Because it's not, right? It's not this super high level education, but also it's not just there for pure entertainment. It's in this really weird spot. But because of that, right? I would argue that's why it gets chosen, because it's a book that is easier to read, but also fosters discussion. So it gets sent out, it gets distributed, and then the book becomes a hit, becomes a classic, because now you have a whole bunch of people that have read the book, right? It's one of their few things that they get to enjoy. And then the GI Bill happens. And so, right, now we have a whole bunch of people being college educated that before the GI Bill would never had that opportunity to do so. And so now we have to completely change and shift the way the way that we look at literature and the way that we teach English, right? And so English goes from, especially at the collegiate level, goes from and switches from being, teaching you how to write certain things or how to formulate and how to exist within the constraints to now being a lot more of looking at the whys, right? And analyzing, right? Because your entire half of your base is no longer what we would consider traditional people that are looking for education, right? Now we are looking at a whole bunch of people, which is for the greater good, right? It's obviously for the greater good that more people get educated, but certainly it changes the way that you have to look at things, the way that you have to educate. And so right now, this niche portion in which this book used to fall into is now very important, because people have a higher ability to get educated, right, and work within, right, and people that were considered not as smart can now get a college education. Well, now a book like this, in which it discusses a very real, very important topic, but without using a lot of what we consider higher level, right? It sits around 9th to 11th grade reading level. It really opens up a whole new world, which really means that this book becomes super popular for that exact reason, right? I would argue it's because of the GI Bill that The Great Gatsby becomes an American classic, which is a fascinating thing to really think about the way that we look at and the way that we approach education. And sometimes, like, these little things, we don't see the consequences until it's way down the line. So that's that, right? That's really, I would argue, how The Great Gatsby becomes an American classic, is through, it fulfills this very niche portion, and then this niche portion becomes a very important portion because of things like the GI Bill, right? And a wider range of people being able to get an education. So that's that, right? That's all that. F. Scott Fitzgerald, in of himself, is not a great person, right? And there's certainly a lot there that, like, you just have, like, that's one of those very hard things, I think, when it comes to reading in general, is very few people are good people when it comes down to it, and Fitzgerald is certainly in no way a good person. So that's that. But yeah, book itself, right? Easiest way to look at this book is through economics, right? It's a discussion of the American dream, discussion about money, and financial dreams of the American dream, right? And a lot of that comes down to the last lines in the book, I would say, which are, if I can open up to the right page for once in my life, right, the last two paragraphs. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Right? Right, that those last few lines, and then the entire chapter 9 really kind of gets into this whole financial aspect of what it means to be living the American dream, right? And really the biggest discussion throughout all of it is the old money versus new money aspect of this, right? It's not a concept that's inherently new, right? This was something that when I read Persuasion, right, Jane Austen, of where when we talked about how, the military allowed people that necessarily weren't of high standing to suddenly be able to have money and have a higher respect than would normally be given to them, right? World War One does the exact same thing, right? In which someone like Jay Gatsby, gets a uniform and gets to be treated like everyone else, right? And it allows him to put on this persona, which eventually causes Daisy to fall in love with him, right? In this kind of whirlwind romance before he gets shipped out to Europe to fight. But, right, that sort of respect that he got from having that, prestige and having that position of being a lieutenant, all of a sudden it washes away as soon as the war's ended, because, well, okay, now what do you do, right? And as described, Jay was wearing his uniform because he didn't have anything else to wear, right? That's how poor he was. And, right, so, right, we're kind of falling into this whole thing again of like, war in one aspect is heavily romanticized, but also the aftermath of war, especially when it comes to what do we do with the people afterwards, is really drawn into question, right? And what eventually happens is, right, Jay has this kind of conniption that, the reason he couldn't have Daisy is because he didn't have money, right? That's what his belief ends up being, is that all he needs is money now. So he gets into bootlegging, he gets into racketeering, right? There's kind of questioning throughout all of it, and at the very end, there's that phone call that comes in when they're talking about horse betting, I believe it is, and I think it is in also chapter 9, but right, that's kind of get the official decision of how does Jay Gatsby earn all of his money. Well, he's been bootlegging, and then also rigging races and whatnot, and racketeering and whatnot to get money, and so then we kind of fall into this whole thing about like what happens with Daisy, right? Why does Daisy, despite being seemingly at least in love with Jay and in love with Gatsby, why does she end up going back with Tom and being civil with Tom and living with that, right? And it becomes a whole question of new money versus old money, right? Jay Gatsby is new money, right? He is inherently unstable, right? He is living a very lavish, very luxurious life, but needs to constantly work for that, right? And right, what that causes is this kind of wild influx of, yes, it's exciting and wonderful, but it's not stable, right? And it doesn't, versus, right, the life that we kind of get to see with Tom Buchanan, in which it is miserable, it's terrible, and she's completely unhappy, and she's getting cheated on, and her husband's having an affair the entire time, right? They're on their honeymoon, and he's having an affair on the honeymoon, but it's stable, right? And as discussed, I think also in chapter 9, right, we get this whole thing of where, they get to destroy and live, and then they get just to retreat in their money and do whatever they want and go somewhere else, right? And they don't have to worry about anything, right? Which really is like this whole thing about American dream is, it is the American dream to become wealthy, become rich, and be able to live, right? But in order to achieve the actual American dream of what we call old money, right, of having that stability, well, you don't ever get to actually see it, right? You're setting that up possibly for someone a couple generations down the line to say that they come from old money and that they're safe and secure and comfortable in what they are, right? There's a huge difference there, right? So that's that. And certainly I think that I would argue that's what from a high school perspective, that's what a lot of people tend to focus on, is that economics portion, because it is so inherent, right? And especially that last chapter, chapter 9, focuses so much on it. I should say that's also why I think this book kind of gets getting taught a lot, is because each chapter has a very specific thing that happens in it, or is very clearly separated from everything else, right? There's not a lot of overflow between the chapters. It's, here's the chapter, here's what happens. Okay, next chapter, here's what happens, right? It's not like a lot of other books in which sometimes, the chapters change based on something that's a little more arbitrary, right? And it's broken up into more chapters versus this, where it's very much, you have slightly longer chapters, but they're very clearly segregated as to what is what, right? And what's happening each chapter. That's just another thought to throw out there. I would say the other important things to note, right, is once again focusing on gender roles and the way that all that works, right? You clearly have a character that in Daisy who would like to have life of her own, but she can't, right? Because it's not what the expectation of her gender is at this point in time, right? She's expected to be happy, right? Because she has a husband that has money, right? But in reality, right, I think it's, maybe chapter 2, in which is describing her in her relationship with Tom, of where, she's always kind of asking about where he is, and that's initially taken to be, this kind of infatuation of love, of where she's so in love with him that she can't exist without him. But in reality, what I would argue is that she's actually doing this because she knows that he cheats, and so she's constantly asking after him, and is worried whenever he's not in the room, because more than likely he's out cheating, right? And then we get a whole, Tom is very brazen and very open about his cheating, right? But then we also get this fantastic little, I think it was chapter 7, in which chapter 8, in which, Tom realizes that Daisy has been seeing Gatsby, and he goes on this whole fit about, women are terrible these days, and, women shouldn't be going anywhere and doing stuff. Women are too outrageous. And it's like, you've been doing this the entire time, Tom. You've been doing exactly that for 12 years. And now you're upset that your wife is doing the same thing that you've been doing for 12 years, right? So yeah. I shouldn't say 12 years, because it wasn't 12 years. I'm thinking of the Wilsons' marriage. 5 years, right? Tom, you've been doing the same thing for 5 years, of going out and constantly seeing other women. In fact, you have a whole apartment in New York just for this one woman. But you're upset because your wife is doing the same thing that you've been doing the entire time, right? So yeah, right. There's just a whole thing there, right? Of what it comes down to is, Tom and Daisy have this weird thing in which they both don't love each other and they both don't want each other, but they have to be married, right? It's because that's just the way the world works for them. And then we get Jordan as a character is very interesting, because she's this hyper independent person, right? She has her own professional career that pays her good money and would let her live as she saw fit, really, if she wanted to. But in the end, she still becomes domineered by her relationships to men, right? Which, you know, just speaks of the time, right? Even, you know, in the 1920s, we have the, you know, great, you know, I won't say creation, but the great, you know, flapper women of the 1920s that are more independent and more willing to be expressive about themselves and be independent of themselves. But in the end, they're still dominated by their relationship towards men and with other men, right? Which, you know, the liberation of women doesn't, you know, I would argue still hasn't occurred, right? Because they're still so dominated by their relationship to men, even if it's not physical relationships. It might be, you know, academic relationships or, you know, sports relationships, right? You know, call Serena Williams the greatest tennis player, and there are a lot of people that are upset or want to try to bring up men that have done the same thing or who also play tennis that are also great, right? But yeah, right. That's all that. There's also the whole big thing about geography and climate that gets kind of expressed here, right? One of the easiest things about this, right, is that Fitzgerald uses the weather to very clearly indicate kind of the tensions that are happening throughout, right? You know, everything blows up on the hottest day of the year, right? When you know, Nick first arrives, you know, it's all about, you know, this cool comfortability, right, that's happening in the area, things like that, right? And then geography wise, right, it's just, you know, East egg, West egg, you have this, you know, desolation in the middle that is where dreams go to die, right? Because it's more or less symbolic of this concept of, you know, trying to move from new money to old money. You know, you're going to kill a whole bunch of people to get there, right? And you're going to get destroyed by doing it, right? That's that. Anything else to say about The Great Gatsby? Cat thoughts? No. Chelsea doesn't have any thoughts. So I think that's that. I think that's everything I have to say about The Great Gatsby.